how are you guys pronouncing the word of this site that they start with, the C word at the bottom of 211? I've been saying,
I had to look it up. Yeah.
you looked at, okay, don't tell me yet. This
Yeah.
is just, I haven't checked, but the way I just
I'm not going
started
to
saying
repeat
it.
it. Yeah. It's not going to be accurate how I say
Oh,
it, I'm
okay.
sure, even though I've heard it.
I just say Katolhayuk. Katolhayuk. Is that close?
Apparently it's a CH. So it's Cha Tolhoyek or something like that.
Chitol, is that
Chatolhoyek.
second syllable emphasized? Or, I don't know why I care so much about this.
Tolhoyek, I guess. I don't know. I watched one of those Julian, that one guy who does all the YouTube videos of like how to pronounce
Chitolhayuk. Chitolhayuk. Huh. Yeah. Anyway.
Tolhoyek. I don't know.
What the hell does that even mean?
What you getting at with the book script? Spit that shit out, man!
When I was your age, television was called books.
Wait a minute. What's your favorite book?
You got the book!
In my hand, Doc! You got it in my hand!
Burn it!
Tells me that goose-stepping morons like yourself should try reading books instead of burning.
Welcome back to Propaganda Loves You Book Club. We are continuing our journey through the dawn of everything. Today we're talking about Chapter 6, the title of which is Gardens of Adonis, the revolution that never happened, how Neolithic peoples avoided agriculture. And so we're coming into some big questions about grand narratives about history, about things like the agricultural revolution or lack thereof, what we'll talk about today. And so I just kind of wanted to do a little context and then ask a question, because I feel like the big picture stuff we're talking about reminded me a little bit of Howard Zinn's thing about history writing, about how there's always some selection to the process. Like even when we're dealing with prehistory and grand narratives about archaeology and ancient human history, at a certain point you have to put a story together. And when you put that story together, you have to make choices of selection. You have to emphasize some things and ignore other things, and that's all part of the process. And with this chapter that we're talking about today, it kind of made me think about how all histories, because they're narratives, are also kind of myths. And if we really appreciate the mythic aspect of these histories we're given, and I think sometimes it's when we fail to appreciate those mythic aspects that we sort of take them as ultimate truth or assume them to be like some immutable truth about the way things used to be. If we're surprised by a new scientific discovery and we realize what we thought we knew isn't actually true. I thought maybe we could start there and just kind of branch out anywhere in the chapter that makes sense for you guys, but as a general question to kind of get us going, in what ways is the agricultural revolution, as a story we've been told, in what ways is that story a myth? And how does this chapter start to reveal that myth?
I think what I got was that traditional anthropology views farming as like, it began out of necessity, and it could be from like food shortage or population growth or pressure. And they kind of unveil how people chose when to farm and how to farm. And it was more like experimental seasonal ritual rather than like what we're told. Yeah.
On top of that, what you said, Arthur, I think maybe what popped out to me the most is when we think of the agricultural revolution, or maybe when it's taught, we think of agriculture in a very specific lens. I don't know what pops into your guys' head, what you think about that, but the first thing that I see is like a donkey or a muskox or something like pulling a plow through a field. And the way that it talked about it here is like agriculture could be understanding what the soil around you does and planning at times that make sense, right? Or locations that make sense. Like you always, I guess, picture a field and tilled rows and like a big fence around it or something like that. But this really kind of spun that on its head and be like, well, no, it's like, traveling people just know where things grow and they like have this innate sense of that type of thing. So it's like a very different type of agriculture, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting too. I'm glad you mentioned the fence thing too, because that they come back to that with the whole Rousseau narrative about enclosures and everything, and sort of contradict that a little bit. but defining what agricultural revolution means is a good place to start. Like, what is agriculture when we think about it? Like, you were just kind of describing what you think of as agriculture, and they get into domestication here, and especially like the nitty-gritty scientific genomic process by which a wild grass becomes a domesticated wheat, which I thought was kind of fascinating and a little pedantic and nerdy at the same time. What is agriculture? Because this chapter just kind of opens it up as to a whole broad array of different things you could be doing. And what we typically think of as agriculture, like a giant monocultural cornfield in Iowa, isn't actually how this stuff started. You know, they get into gardening and things like that. Do you catch all the gardening stuff in here? So what is agriculture really when we talk about what people do with their food? What does that mean, agriculture?
I think of the more pragmatic agriculture. I envision wheat fields and cows, and that it's like once the Europeans had cows and dairy, it's all progress from there. They open it up to playful, creative stuff, which I love.
I think I was just going to agree. Like, before reading this chapter, I would have definitely said, if you talk about agriculture, I would have only thought of it from a sustenance perspective. Like, it's all you're doing is you're creating farmland and you're raising crops to eat and to live. Like, that's the only thing I guess I really would have thought of. And then this goes into other reasons for cultivating crops and whatnot that I thought was kind of interesting, you know, when I was talking about like the clay and like the clay figurines and stuff like that they were creating from that.
Yeah, even just like the way they chose to title the chapter, The Gardens of Adonis, they begin with this whole story coming out of ancient Greece of this fertility rite, this sort of seasonal thing that would take place in the summer. And it was almost just like growing specific plants, not because they did anything functional for the community, but because that time of year they would grow super fast, go all the way through the process, and then just the way culturally that they treated that process became like a deep, almost religious ceremony, a thing to do just for the pleasure of doing it with your community, not because it provided any food or provided any shelter or, you know, added calories to the bank or whatever the case may be. But I think that's sort of pointing to like other reasons people could have in history for doing weird things with plants and animals. It's not always just, oh, we need more calories, let's find a way to produce more calories, in this kind of reductive way that some historians look at the things that humans did in the past. And so I thought it was an interesting way to start the chapter. And maybe just reading a little bit from this paragraph on 211 where they pose some of these questions we're dealing with after going through this history of the ritual of Adonis that Athenians did. The authors say, or ask rather, was farming from the very beginning about the serious business of producing more food to supply growing populations? Most scholars assume, as a matter of course, that this had to be the principal reason for its invention. But maybe farming began as a more playful or even subversive kind of process, or perhaps even as a side effect of other concerns, such as the desire to spend longer in particular kinds of locations where hunting and trading were the real priorities. Which of these two ideas really embodies the spirit of the first agriculturalists? Is it the stately and pragmatic thesmophoria, or the playful and self-indulgent gardens of Adonis? So I guess they had juxtaposed the Adonis thing with another ceremony that was more serious. I can't remember the details of that off the top of my head, but yeah, why would people want to grow food in the first place?
Yeah.
What's the silliest reason you guys could think of for starting a farm?
Religious rights, I guess. Like if I could just make up like a spaghetti god and like I'm like, oh, I gotta grow wheat to please the spaghetti god. There I go. I'm starting a farm or spaghetti and tomatoes.
It's like the silliest reason I could think of would be to destroy whatever you're farming, because that'd be a lot of wasted effort. But
Yeah.
then but the thing that I was also thinking there, and this connects to what you're saying at the first, right? Like clearly they were farming at times without the intent of, you know, getting food, right? Like it was for other reasons. And we do some of that. Well, we do, I think, a lot of that today, probably in like small communities have like community gardens, whether it's like a flower garden or, you know, stuff like that. So it's like also that community aspect. Like, are you really getting a ton of sustenance just from like those small co-op gardens, right? Like you're not getting enough to live off of, and it's probably more about just the act of doing it, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, totally. And as you were pointing that out, I immediately jumped to lawns and like how wheat is a kind of grass, and like If you own a small house and you have a lawn, you're a small-time farmer for no good reason. Like, what are you doing with that grass?
How much effort there was I think it was a Freakonomics episode that talked about what goes into lawns and the amount of water that's spent on the American lawn and just the insanity of actually trying to grow these lawn grasses in places where it's like you've got way better options. They're way less destructive.
I got an aunt that lives in Palm Desert area, and that area, like per capita, has the most golf courses, and it is just ridiculous. And first of all, it's a desert, and they're pumping in all this water from like California and Colorado, and they're like propping it up. It's just this rich area where people don't need to live.
Yeah, lots of silly things that we already do with farming that don't lead to useful results. So, but also this, you said tomatoes, Arthur, in one of your examples, and I was thinking if we bring back play kings and real freedoms, then a silly reason for having a farm could be just to grow tomatoes to throw at the kings we don't like. But okay, so agriculture is one thing, and we're trying to unpack the agricultural revolution. So when we think about changes in modes of production, changes in technology, changes in the way that humans interact with the environment, what does a revolution mean in this context? What do we expect to see when we have some sort of technological revolution, like the agricultural one?
Yeah, I think on one hand, it shows like some sort of enormous growth spurt. And then on the second hand, it's like a dying off of the old and in with the new. Kind of like this AI one right now, where the old is human labor and the companies now are getting rid of human labor. So I would assume like with farming, it's kind of the same thing where it's like out with the old, which might be hunting, and in with the new, which is domesticity.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I guess my head always goes to the Industrial Revolution and like, actually, I don't know if this was part of the Industrial Revolution or if it was like a different type of revolution, but like the Model T, Ford, like production lines, right? Like, and that kind of like different mode of assembly and whatnot. That's kind of where my head goes. And then the corresponding thing is like we used to be able to make 10 things, now we can make 100 things because we had this revolution in how we're creating stuff.
So like a drastic increase over a short period of time in productive capacity, basically, is what we're expecting, right? And part of what I appreciated historically about what these authors do in this chapter is really point out how big of a time we're talking about with this so-called agricultural revolution. They point to a period of some 3,000 years, the same amount of time they point out between us today and the legend of the Trojan War, right? That amount of time is the amount of time it took for this agricultural, quote-unquote, revolution to take place. So what kind of revolution takes 3,000 years?
That was really interesting. It made me think about like, yeah, how long did each of these other revolutions that we talk about? And it's like, it almost seems like they keep shortening, or maybe that's just the fact of, recorded history. People like to label things more than previously. Yeah, who knows, right?
Yeah, so they're pointing out how big of a time period this is and just how much was going on here. First of all, how diverse the cultures are in this area that they're focusing on in this chapter, which geographically, if you're not reading the book with us, we're talking about the Fertile Crescent, the area between Palestine, the Mediterranean Sea, all the way over to like Iran, including Turkey and Iraq and Syria and everything. So this whole area, some 11 to 13,000 years ago, is roughly what they're talking about in this chapter. But this period of 3,000 years where the agricultural revolution supposedly took place, there's a whole lot going on in culture and a whole lot going on in terms of what different groups of people are doing with plants or not doing with plants, what they're doing with animals or not doing with animals, as well as political changes going on and differences between the communities, which we can get into at some point. For one of the sites that they focus on, Çatalhöyük, which is the lowland community they focus on, there's a sort of differentiation between an upland and a lowland in this geographic area. So Çatalhöyük was more, I think they kind of quibble with the term matriarchy, but it's a more egalitarian, society that emphasized the roles of women a lot more in their culture compared to the upland societies that were more patriarchal and sort of there isn't a whole lot of evidence of reverence for women in that culture. But trying to sort of do what the authors do empathically, we can try to creatively imagine what it was like to live in one of these communities during this stretch of time that supposedly some technological revolution is taking place. And I thought this paragraph at the top of 222, I can just read and try to imagine what it would be like to live in one of these communities or live in one of these structures, and just how slow and I'm tempted to say peaceful, but who knows, because there's a lot that could be going on that we don't know about. But just temporally speaking, how slow and tortoise-like time might seem to move in one of these communities. The residents of Çatalhöyük seem to have placed great value on routine. We see this most clearly in the fastidious reproduction of domestic layouts over time. Individual houses were typically in use for between 50 and 100 years, after which they were carefully dismantled and filled in to make foundations for superseding houses. Clay wall went up on clay wall in the same location for century after century, over periods reaching up to a full millennium. Still more astonishing, smaller features such as mud-built hearths, ovens, storage bins, and platforms often follow the same repetitive patterns of construction over similarly long periods. Even particular images and ritual installations come back again and again in different renderings, but the same locations, often widely separated in time. This house is built on the fifth or sixth foundation of whatever ancient house that this family has lived in. So I don't know, I just thought it was fascinating to try to imagine how slow life must have been like in one of those communities.
That's a really cool imagery, it just really connects you to your own personal roots, I guess, and family. That's really cool. I love how they also talk about how this, is it a city, region? Çatalhöyük. They talk about how since the 1990s, they found these farming inconsistencies where it's like, they had these wild cow, they weren't actually domesticated. They had like what they thought were shrines are actually just more like houses, and they kind of like bled in the whole like divine and rural life together. And they found these figurines, these woman matriarchy figurines, like in like dumps too, they were saying. They're not really venerated. So it's just a really interesting part of Turkey, modern day Turkey. And yeah, the life, it just must have been so different with their customs. And I love how they're experimenting. It just kind of goes back to earlier chapters where they're obviously experimenting with things that are different around them, much more egalitarian, maybe.
Joe, you're talking about how it must have seemed really long. I guess it took me a second to think about that, but we might feel like, where did I read this? It was somewhere. I'll try and remember it later, but like the politics of inevitability or something like that, like the thought process that, we've been this way for like 80 years since the civil rights era, and therefore we will continue, and progress goes in this linear fashion of like, we're going to continue to get better, and like that kind of mindset. And then you think about someone that could be like, well, this is the 7th iteration of this house that's built in the exact same place, like the exact same methodology. So like you're talking like 700 years of people living in this one location the same way. The rapid advancement of technology the way it is today, maybe like I guess that's where my head was going. It was like trying to actually relate to what would that feel like if we feel like we had the politics of inevitability sometime, like back then when it was literally like hundreds and hundreds of years of the exact same village layout, like familial home, right? Like, yeah, that's crazy to think about.
Yeah, just that shift in perspective is really hard to wrap your head around, because just the way we live now is just so, I don't know, motivated for the next success. Like it's always leaning into the next installment, the next development, the next productive jump, the next productive leap, whatever. Everybody seems to be rushing toward the end of history, and there are all these, end of the world narratives that we could talk about, and how technology is also reproducing that narrative in some way with AI, and how weird the tech valley people are about their messiah complex, which we've mentioned before. But yeah, really trying to wrap your head around how it might have seemed to a person living in a house that family had been in for 700 years, house on top of house on top of house.
Have you guys heard, you remember Inside, Bo Burnham, the thing he did? There's a song
Yeah.
at the very end, That Funny Feeling, and he has a line that's like 20,000 years of this and 7 more to go. So it's like nowadays it's kind of got tens of thousands of years. And now we are thinking, to your point earlier, Joe, like, oh, well, end of times. Like we've only got a limited amount left.
Yeah, this obsession with the end of times is very weird. Part of my childhood religious trauma, too, just this whole thing that, like, he's coming back any day now, and it's going to be the end of the world. You know, that was, like, a really visceral part of my religious upbringing that got issues with, obviously. But also coming back to something they bring in later in the chapter when they talk about Claude Lévi-Strauss, which was a famous mid-20th century anthropologist, and this different approach to scientific discovery. He talked about the difference between the science of the concrete, the sort of hands-on experimental approach, getting out there in nature, doing things with plants, recording your results, making changes over time, or the sort of white coat in a lab approach of being really removed as a subject from the thing you're trying to study, and how we have those two different approaches to science. But this village life that we're imagining here with Çatalhöyük and this slow day-to-day routine way of life, also this is the community that was doing the gardens and having the female figurines, and they get into this chapter about how all of the women were likely the ones doing the scientific discovery and this process of innovation with technology and plants and animals and everything, and how that whole process just must have seemed much more like curiosity and play mixed together on a day-to-day basis rather than this anxious rush toward the next big discovery, right? Can we just try to imagine those different processes of scientific discovery? I don't know. I just feel like one just feels so much more fun right off the bat.
It's like, one, you're doing it because it's like, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure there's still like passion involved now, but like there's passion, but then there's also like, well, I got to get my shit out so I can get a grant, right, to keep doing this scientific discovery. You know what I mean? Like it comes back to like, how are we going to fund this thing?
Do we want to talk about our boy Yuval Noah Harari again? Because they bring that beef up again in this chapter and sort of call him out for the way he approaches ancient humans. Did that moment strike you as interesting? Anything we want to talk about there?
I actually highlighted this one specifically because I think this is the first time that I caught what you've been talking about in here, like the kind of like catty, like a little bit of back and forth academic comments that they make. So I'll just read. I think I started on 230. Yuval Harari waxes eloquent on this point, asking us to think for a moment about the agricultural revolution from the viewpoint of wheat. 10,000 years ago, he points out, wheat was just another form of wild grass of no special significance, but within the space of a few millennia, it was growing over large parts of the planet. How did it happen? The answer, according to Harari, is that wheat did it by manipulating Homo sapiens to its advantage. This ape, he writes, had been living a fairly comfortable life, hunting and gathering until about 10,000 years ago, but then began to invest more and more effort in cultivating wheat. If wheat didn't like stones, humans had to clear them from their fields. If wheat didn't want to share its space with other plants, people were obliged to labor under the hot sun weeding them out. If wheat craved water, people had to lug it from one place to another, and so on.
Exhale. I can just read that next section. There's something ineluctable about all this. I love that they use that word ineluctable, by the way. That is a weird word. I think it, to me, just means like something you can't avoid being attracted to. There's something ineluctable about all this, but only if we accept the premise that it does in fact make sense to look at the whole process from the viewpoint of wheat. On reflection, humans are very large-brained and intelligent primates, and wheat is, well, a sort of grass. Of course, there are non-human species that have, in a sense, domesticated themselves. The house mouse, the sparrow are among them, and so too probably the dog, all found incidentally in early Neolithic villages of the Middle East. It's also undoubtedly true that, over the long term, ours is a species that has become enslaved to its crops. Wheat, rice, millet, and corn feed the world, and it's hard to envisage modern life without them. But to make sense of the beginnings of Neolithic farming, we surely need to try and see it from the perspective of the Paleolithic, not of the present, and still less from the viewpoint of some imaginary race of bourgeois ape men. Of course, this is harder to do, but the alternative is to slip back into the realms of myth-making, retelling the past as a just-so story, which makes our present situation seem somehow inevitable or preordained. Harari's retelling is appealing, we suggest, not because it's based on any evidence, but because we've heard it 1,000 times before, just with a different cast of characters. In fact, many of us have been hearing it from infancy. Once again, we're back in the Garden of Eden. Except now, it's not a wily serpent who tricks humanity into sampling the forbidden fruit of knowledge. It's the fruit itself, i.e. the cereal grains. We already know how this one goes. Humans were once living a fairly comfortable life, subsisting from the blessings of nature, but then we made our most fatal mistake. Lured by the prospect of a still easier life, of surplus and luxury, of living like gods, we had to go and tamper with that harmonious state of nature, and thus unwittingly turn ourselves into slaves.
Have you ever read any Harari? I know he wrote *Sapiens* or something, but I've never read any.
Yeah, I did read *Sapiens*, I think it was 2015 or 2016 when I read that book, and I was just starting my whole academic journey at that point. It felt like a really smart book at the time, and I was like, wow, This is so cool. But now it's like, oh, okay.
It's so hard in college when they give you these books to read, or high school, whatever, and it's like you have these authors who speak with such authority and assumption, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I believe you.
Yeah, totally. I've had this experience a million times, just one of the most important lessons I feel like just learning over and over again when you read more, it's like, it's very easy to get convinced by someone who speaks with confidence and who writes with authority. When you read, you kind of, I don't know, this was kind of the stuff I nerded out about in my literature dissertation. It was about how the process of reading works psychologically and what it's doing to your head and everything as you read. And it's you're kind of just slipping your consciousness onto this pathway that someone else formed and trying it on. And when it feels like it makes sense and it clicks on a certain, you're like, oh, this must be the truth. This must be right.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're just wearing somebody else's point of view, and it just feels true to you until you get another one that's more confident, that points out the error of the old one, like this passage we're talking about. And it's like, oh, what do I even think now? I don't know. I don't know. It makes you appreciate how much you don't know in a big way.
I was skimming the Phaedrus because I got it downstairs, and I was interested in this Garden of Adonis thing and the whole metaphor, and I relearned that the Phaedrus itself, where they get the quote of this farm of Adonis, is like a metaphor for knowledge. And Phaedrus kind of thinks that knowledge is kind of like the sophist movement of really nice talking, but there's not a lot of depth there. It's not real knowledge, kind of like the Garden of Adonis, it's aesthetic. And then Plato and Socrates think that real knowledge is deep, fertile garden bed where it's dialectic and it's actually spoken to each other and understood, unlike the aesthetic written word, which can look fancy, but nobody can really defend it or talk about it because they're gone and it's just written there. So they kind of do the same thing here with Harari, where Harari has this kind of sophist telling of agriculture. And then in reality, we know that, maybe it's more playful and it's more whatever. But this is interesting how they talk about this as a appealing argument rather than it being based on any evidence, which gets lost with written word, I think.
Yeah, like they say, it's convincing because it fits into a pattern we've already heard so many times, and it just clicks and feels like it makes sense.
Which is kind of funny. That's kind of what Plato does, though, with farming in general, being oh, it's inevitable. It treats hierarchy, and it was needed. So I don't know.
No, I think I've made the point before that every person contains contradictions. And Plato too, he was just a person, also contradictory.
Well, I guess the one thing that, and we could save this to the end, or maybe that's even for the final wrap up or something like that. But I guess part of me feels like it doesn't seem like a illogical conclusion to draw, just given where we are and when we started recorded history, right? I get that that's the whole point of the book, right? Prehistory and looking at the anthropological study of it. But and part of me thinks is this just the dominant traits or dominant traits of some humans winning out at some point? People that took this on were also the ones that were looking for more power, and eventually those overtook more of the egalitarian societies because they didn't have that same format. I don't know. That's kind of the thing that's been kicking around in my head. Like, is this just evolution in some way, right? Like over thousands of years. But I don't know. Maybe that's something a longer conversation near the end. But
No, I mean, that's an interesting point to play with. I guess my follow-up question is like, we can look at evolutionary changes with any living organism over time as a natural process. Like natural selection happens based on which organisms are most suitably adapted to that environment at that time, and they happen to survive and reproduce more. But what's the difference here with the way they're approaching ancient human history? What do they keep insisting on over and over again that isn't part of the conversation in evolution? It's the conscious political choices people make at specific moments in time. One way of looking at it, you could say the people who had a dominating sort of way of orienting towards society that are more hierarchical, more interested in power and control, were able to overtake and control the more egalitarian people, because the egalitarian people by nature aren't interested in that kind of behavior, and they get overtaken. But I think to their point in the whole book is, how did we get stuck? Maybe that's how we get stuck, is by allowing the dominant sides of the species to dominate everything. And we end up with capitalism, where we are now. The crux, I guess, is how to make the conscious political choices that lead away from being stuck.
Yeah, I love that. It's not like farming led to hierarchy. It's like some people, a certain class of people, learned how to freeze the experiment of everything that we've been doing because they can make that advantage permanent and they can stick around in power and they love it.
so maybe it's more just, I guess, highlighting examples of how it's been different in the past in order to give people ideas of how it could be different in the future. And it's not this intractable thing that's always been, right? Like that's really the message there.
Yeah, I think so. What are you going to say, Arthur?
Yeah, I was also going to say, like, and to kind of like unveil like the greatest PR campaign of all time that the ultra rich and powerful have made up and instilled in all of us over thousands of years.
Yeah, I don't want to jump the gun on the book, but I think one of the, I don't know, I've listened to this book on tape before. This is my first time like actually reading it. I think listening to books does count depending on how good your attention is. So I'm not trying to say that audiobooks don't count, but this is my first time reading the book. But from what I remember, they kind of get to this point about nation states near the end of the book, because all these examples we've seen in prehistory and ancient history, and that we'll continue to see in the later chapters, is just different ways of doing society. Some of them have hierarchy, some of them have slaves, some of them are very dominant and like domineering or whatever, and some of them are more egalitarian. There's a mixture, and that it sort of shifts back and forth. There are choices people make, different ways of doing things. And that process has been unfolding for, like, as far as we know, 200,000 years or more. Some of those dominant cultures figured out they experimented in a new way and figured out how to consolidate power in a bigger and bigger and bigger way, which I think leads to the nation state question as a mechanism of control. So I think that's where the argument will end up near the end of the book, from my memory. What'd you think about flood farming, flood retreat farming? I thought that was fascinating as a lazy way to be productive.
Yeah. And it made me think about something else. So like the flood retreat, like is I the basic concept from the book is basically, right, like, you have flood zones that are going to deposit silt minerals, like all these things. And as they retreat, then people are going to come in and throw seeds and like grow what grows well there. So that was interesting. But the thing I took away from that more is there's a lot of intelligence that needs to be like kind of like part of that to know what grows where, what seeds when, what the soil needs to look like. That requires a lot of knowledge. Like you try to send people out to like do that today, how long would it take for somebody that has no farming experience to like figure that out, right? Like that's not a thing that's just like, oh yeah, we know how to do this right away. You know what I mean? Like it's more advanced, I guess, than it sounds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And it shows that like it kind of turns the hierarchy again on its head, where it's like these large areas could actually be controlled without forced labor and seasonally, and have it be like mutual timing, not like coercion, I guess. And it's like agriculture can exist without a ruling class or rulers, I guess, dictating that.
Totally. Yeah. That's like one of the distinctions they point out between this lowland society that practiced some forms of agriculture in different ways, like the flood farming, and they didn't have much evidence of hierarchy or anything like that. But this flood farming thing, like to your point, Cody, yeah, seems, like I said, lazy and easy. And from a labor point of view, maybe it doesn't require a lot of actual manual labor once you figure out the best times to do it, the best places to do it, how it changes season to season. But as you're pointing out, it requires a lot of intelligence, a lot of patience, a lot of studying, and let's be honest, a lot of science, a lot of figuring shit out in a very technical way. And this, again, is their point about the contributions of women in this lowland society. As we were imagining earlier, where you have a house that's built the same way, century after century after century on top of each other, and you have this slow, casual routine of day-by-day work, you've got all the time in the world to study these patterns and figure these things out and play with it and learn what works best. And that's, I think, how they had the time to figure it out. The point they also bring up, circling back to Rousseau and this whole enclosure idea with agriculture, is that this is an anti-enclosure form of agriculture, because the best spots to do the flood farming every year aren't the same. They change. You put up some permanent enclosure, next year you need to farm somewhere else, so it's pointless, right? And so there's an incentive not to have enclosures and to actually mutually share the distribution of resources and collaborate with people in the region. I just thought that was a different and beautiful take on what agriculture could be.
I mean, imagine way more. There's a word for it. There's a word for farming where it's basically like you don't have to constantly add nutrients and manure and like all these things. I can't remember what the word is, but it also reminded me of just basically like some of the North American like mound farming, how they would put like these specific plants that they knew would grow well together and then also put nutrients back into the soil. So it's not like you're taking everything away from the soil, at the same time. It reminded me of that, right? Because the silt's coming in, you're getting all those nutrients from this deposit. So it's not like you're trying to grow crops where they wouldn't naturally grow. You're finding that best location. So it's more in tune with nature. There is a word for it. I'll remember it someday. But
I don't know either. Maybe like biodynamic farming or something. I don't know. That's just more.
I was going to say no-till.
Yeah, no, yeah, totally. I was just gonna joke that Rousseau's like the first anti-monocropist, mono farming. He's totally
Yeah.
against it.
True. What you were saying, Cody, just made me think about, I haven't done the actual reading or research on this. I've just seen people talk about it on TikTok, mainly people who talk about farming and agriculture and indigenous stuff, about how one of the claims the colonists made in North America was that the natives weren't making use of the land, right? They didn't have a right to it because they weren't putting it into production. They weren't making it do things. And that was kind of the first hot take the colonists had, that they codified into law and justified, genocide and kicking people off their lands and everything. But a lot of people have started to point out that much of North America was a very carefully managed over many centuries, maybe what you just put in the chat, regenerative agriculture, how these food forests that we think of as just wild woodland North American forests were actually carefully managed and curated over time to produce food crops that people could depend on without having to have this huge industrial farming operation that we think of today. And another thing your comment made me think about when you were talking about nutrients and everything that get left behind when the flood retreats is how that reverses the problem we have now with factory farming and industrial runoff. Why can't I swim in the Potomac? Because all these farms upstream just dump all their pesticides and the rain washes it into the streams and it comes down the Potomac to the ocean. And now all of our waterways are toxic, right? What we're talking about with this flood farming is totally the opposite of that. It makes use of the nutrients that are naturally already there in the water. And we're not adding all this chemical stuff left over from World War II or whatever. I don't know. I feel like it's DuPont's fault.
that's exactly what I was kind of thinking of there. Yeah, it's just yeah, more we're living with the environment and not destroying it. I'll just read this one paragraph that kind of encompasses some of this. This was on page 239, and so it's the second paragraph, and it says, instead of fixed fields, they exploited alluvial soils on the margins of lakes and springs, which shifted location from year to year. Instead of hewing wood, tilling fields, and carrying water, they found ways of persuading nature to do much of the labor for them. Theirs was not a science of domination and classification, but of bending and coaxing, nurturing and cajoling, or even tricking the forces of nature to increase the likelihood of securing a favorable outcome. Their laboratory was the real world of plants and animals whose innate tendencies they exploited through close observation and experimentation. This Neolithic model of cultivation was, moreover, highly successful. I just think that like encompasses everything we were just talking about, and it really highlights to me that we might not think of major technological advancements during that time, but to them, like, as they figure these things out, like, oh, they probably increase crop yields, or like, they're to them, that was probably some major technological advancements, like, so it's just a different mindset.
The last thing I wanted to do is just kind of read the last few paragraphs of the chapter, because again, they do a great job of summarizing their whole point at the end of every chapter and reminding the reader of, what their argument is or what they're trying to do or anything. Let's listen to the authors real quick. They say, let's recap a little further. A founding block in that old evidence of human social evolution was the allocation of a specific place in history to foraging societies, which was to be the prelude to an agricultural revolution that supposedly changed everything about the course of history. The job of foragers in this conventional narrative is to be all that farming is not, and thus to explain by implication what farming is. If farmers are sedentary, foragers must be mobile. If farmers actively produce food, foragers must merely collect it. If farmers have private property, foragers must renounce it. And if farming societies are unequal, this is by contrast with the innate egalitarianism of foragers. Finally, if a particular group of foragers should happen to possess any such features in common with farmers, the dominant narrative demands that these can only be incipient or emergent or deviant in nature, so that the destiny of foragers is either to evolve, quote-unquote, into farmers, or eventually to wither and die. It will by now be increasingly obvious to any reader that almost nothing about this established narrative matches the available evidence. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, long regarded as the cradle of the agricultural revolution, there was in fact no switch from Paleolithic forager to Neolithic farmer. In most cases, this only began to happen millennia after its inception. In the centuries between, people were effectively trying farming on for size, play farming, if you will, switching between modes of production, much as they switched their social structures back and forth. Clearly, it no longer makes any sense to use phrases like the agricultural revolution when dealing with the processes of such inordinate length and complexity. And since there was no Eden-like state from which the first farmers could take their first steps on the road to inequality, it makes even less sense to talk about agriculture as marking the origins of social rank, inequality, or private property. In the Fertile Crescent, it is, if anything, among upland groups furthest removed from a dependence on agriculture that we find stratification and violence becoming entrenched, while their lowland counterparts who linked the production of crops to important social rituals came out looking decidedly more egalitarian. And much of this egalitarianism relates to an increase in the economic and social visibility of women reflected in their art and ritual. All this raises an obvious question. If the adoption of farming actually set humanity, or some small part of it, on a course away from violent domination, what went wrong?
Centralized currency and property rights, property laws, whatever. That's pretty good. Yeah, like how did the field of Adonis turn into the Demeter field of permanence, and how come we can't get unstuck? And maybe if we remember how, I guess we've forgotten how to be playful, and people have taken it, the ruling class has obviously taken advantage of this, and they have no desires for change because they're profiting. So does it shift back to an experimental life if it means dismantling that system at the top? Is it dismantling capitalism?
Just thinking about all the NPSM surveillance stuff going on. Just thinking about everything I say on the podcast now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be on a list at some point, I'm sure. But yeah, it's the scale kind of stands out to me, I guess. I like when they point out different perspectives in time that help reshape the way I oriented things, because like we were saying earlier, it can feel so strongly like this is the way things are, this is the way they're just going to be, it's always going to be this way. But then I remember with this story that we read about today, this whole period was 3,000 years, a time frame that any nation state we can think of now just doesn't have a meaningful concept for. And what will it be like, I don't know, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, when we talk about what was the United States or something like that, and like how, you can, the way they talk about the United States in Star Trek, for example, it's like the year 2300 or 2400 or something, and they talk about all those wars in the 21st century that we've evolved past at this point. Just kind of fantasizing and imagining that kind of future for me.
Not the bunker future where we're in indentured servitude to.
And
Yeah.
in the middle of those two is the alien Earth future with 5 corporations running all of the galaxy. Right.
We just become the Ferengi at that point.
I love how they point out the, who would have thought that egalitarian societies had better economic and social visibility for women and probably other people, and that hierarchy and capitalism lead to the opposite of that. It seems much healthier to live one form of life.
I guess the other thing that pops into my head, and maybe this again is something we can talk about more when we wrap up the book, but what does population actually play into it? Like, what can we sustainably have on the earth? Because whenever you talk about population, people are like, oh, we have so many things on the earth, like we could have 80 billion people. I'm obviously making up that number, but realistically, is that a part of it? Does that play into the type of society you could have? It makes me think about that just from like a sustainability perspective, the way that they talk about this farming. Like, obviously, when you have millions and millions of people, you need more food, right? And you can't do this type of farming of like the floodplain farming across the United States. So I guess that's another thing that my head just, kind of tries to reconcile with as we're reading through the book.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a good thing to think about, because it's like, it's part of the chain of reasons they give for the agricultural revolution, that city centers were propping up, populations were increasing, and so they just had to find some way to increase the amount of calories produced to feed all these people. And my feeling about it, or my curiosity about it, based on everything we're reading in the book, is like, what if the causal relationship there is actually in the reverse, in that some people found ways to use agriculture, not how this lowland society was, in a playful, egalitarian way where they got some of their resources from farming, but they also foraged and domesticated some animals and stuff like that, and they just had a variety of things going on rather than one monocultural thing going on. What if some of the hierarchical societies that were playing with farming realized that they could control a lot of labor and produce a leisure class that got to enjoy the fruits of that labor while everybody else did the work, and that the more they did that, the more they could enjoy the leisurely aspects of life, and so that the increasing numbers of people came from a need to reproduce this kind of hierarchy rather than from a need to feed all these people who are suddenly popping up in the same place. Does that make sense, that sort of reversal?
Yeah, I think so. To me, it just comes back to greed in some form, whether that's like money or whether it's, control, whatever. Like greed for leisure time, or like greed for not having to work, but I'm smart enough to convince others to do it for me and say like, oh, but if we all do this and, you have food, right? But I'm controlling the food. It is interesting to kind of reverse there.
Yeah, I just feel like the most common, I feel like I've been talking about this with my students lately because we're reading about all these labor movements in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the US. But I feel like one of the most commonly shared human experiences in history is to have your labor exploited by somebody else, to have your energy that you put into producing something exploited, and you're not given the full fruits of that labor. And I feel like this agricultural revolution thing is part of that, of like why does, just stretching it forward to today, why does Elon Musk care so much that birth rates are declining? Why does someone with that much power want there to be maintained this super high number of population, right? I feel like the incentive is for the people who want to exploit the labor to have a huge pool of replaceable laborers that they can just switch in and switch out whenever it's convenient, right? If that pool of laborers wasn't so big, or was organized even, it would be a whole lot harder to exploit it. That makes sense.
Yeah. And then I don't know if it's more cynical or if it's like a yes and white replacement theory that Elon Musk believes.
A random bit of internet funny stuff. I don't know if you know who Zach Fox is. He's a DJ, but also an internet person, cultural figure, but he was talking shit about Elon Musk, and it's just talking about his body. He was like, why does he look like he swallowed the big JBL speaker? Like, he was talking about how Elon's chest is just so huge and strange and weird. It's like, why are his bones that big? Why is that like a Keurig machine inside his chest? What is going on with his chest? Elon's a weird figure. He looks weird. He says weird stuff. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
I'm pretty sure he just wants to be one of those 4 corporations that runs the world. Actually, he probably wants to be the corporation that runs the world, but, you know, it's whatever it is.
Don't think he's the smartest billionaire, so I feel like other people are going to beat him to it and sort of manipulate him. Probably already are, like Christopher Yarvin dangling
Right.
Elon's puppet strings or whatever.
The smartest billionaires probably the ones that aren't blasting away on Twitter.
You don't hear about him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I like this book. It's a bit of a slog to get through because it's like dense historical stuff. There's a lot of details and everything. But yeah, I appreciate reading it for sure.
Yeah, this chapter was a little harder for me. It was a partial retread of a lot. Like, they introduce concepts repeatedly, right? Which I get. Of course, you're going to repeat because you're trying to get this in, but felt like we've talked about farming quite a bit already up to this point. But I really did like how the last chapter we're looking at California and Canada and the Pacific coast, and now we're jumping all the way back to the Fertile Crescent, and we looked at the eastern seaboard, right? So it's great how they're not just focusing in on one area, and I know that's like the point, right? Look at all these different ways people organized separate from each other all over the world, separated by hundreds or thousands of years, and just kind of really drive that point home of like, it's not a linear path. It's not like X happened, then A, B, C. So I think it's effective, I guess is what I'm saying in drawing that out.
For sure. Yeah. And like to your point, it's kind of like a big academic book technique is to recircle to your argument over and over again and make the same argument, but with different evidence. So you just sort of hammer home the same point, but with new support, and just sort of round out the whole view. And to like connect to what you were saying, chapter 7, which we'll discuss next time, is the ecology of freedom, how farming first hopped, stumbled, and bluffed its way around the world. And we haven't talked about the maps yet, but we've gotten 2 maps. We'll get another one in the next chapter, but there's just looking at this map on page 253, you can get a sense of how broad of a view they're going to take with regard to how farming worked all over the world. So join us next time where we'll discuss farming all over the world in ancient human history. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone who would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time.
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.